Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I've been asked to make a couple of announcements. One is that you may tape his remarks if you wish, and the other is that you may not smoke. No smoking, please. Our speaker tonight is very much a man on the move. Not only has he covered the United States as a critical observer and reporter of the significant political events of our time, but he also has spent a considerable stretch of his career abroad. His assignments have taken him to Africa, the Near East, the Middle East, the Far East, Western Europe, the Balkan countries, and for 2 years in the middle 1960s, Vietnam. I suppose Mr. Morgan could be described as an all-purpose journalist, one of those rare persons equally at home and equally effective in all media. He began his professional career in journalism as a newspaper reporter in the 1930s, and since then he has worked as a wire service reporter, as a war correspondent for a newspaper and a radio network, as a magazine writer and editor, as a freelance writer, and as a writer, producer, and correspondent in the media for which he is known best, radio and television. Among the vast range of situations and events that Mr. Morgan has covered were national political conventions, election night developments, presidential inaugurations, and the administrations of a succession of presidents. Mr. Morgan returned to the ABC network in 1969 after a 2-year leave of absence during which he was seen and heard on a special public broadcast laboratory series from Washington. He now is heard regularly on ABC Radio and frequently appears on ABC TV. Mr. Morgan's topic this evening is A News Correspondent Looks at the Upcoming National Elections, the final lecture in a series of 3 on next year's election story. So it's my pleasure to present one of America's distinguished broadcast journalists, Mr. Edward P. Morgan. Mr. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. You mind if I dig into my private stock down here just a minute? This is not a Jackie Gleason act. This is just in case things get dry. I can be dry. But coming up this afternoon from the airport in Des Moines, we crossed past this, what's it called, the Nationally Diseased Animals Center. And it reminded me of an incident that, even though this is a renowned state university interested in these kinds of things, you may not have heard of this particular incident. It involved the former President Johnson, who, as you undoubtedly do know, breeds Hereford cattle on the Pedernales. But he was having some trouble. The cows weren't calving sufficiently, and he couldn't figure out what was wrong, and he finally got a hold of a friend of his in the Food and Agriculture Organization, which, as you know, is a branch of the United Nations. Told him his problem, and they said, we'll fix it, and they sent him a bull. And the bull arrived and went sashaying off into the North 40 and just stood there. And finally, a rather winsome but emboldened cow went up to him and said, "Hey, Jack, what gives?" And the bull drew himself up to his full height and said, "Madam, I am a United Nations bull. I am here in an advisory capacity." Well, it appears that I'm here in an advisory capacity, since you've already had Senator Harris and Senator Packwood, two good friends of mine across the aisle, and I see by the University Daily this morning that Senator Packwood has settled the situation by saying that President Nixon will be renominated and reelected. So I don't know what there is for me to advise you about. And furthermore, I have to warn you that what advisoring I do, I hope it will not be loathsomely partisan, but it may not seem particularly nonpartisan because, as a reporter almost inevitably does, he attacks or criticizes or analyzes, as you will, the ins more sharply than the outs. You may have seen that cartoon in the Wall Street Journal last week where a used car salesman was pointing to this wreck over here to the likely buyer, and he said, "This has the absolute ultimate in safety devices. It won't run." Well, the country at times doesn't seem to run, does it? But miraculously enough, it still does somehow. Many blame the president for its not running on all 4 or 8. This is not necessarily fair, but this is par for the course because, as I said, the ins always get it rather than the outs. I saw my first bumper sticker in Washington yesterday. It said, "Is Nixon through in '72?" There's bound to be a sequel to that, Agnew 2. However, Secretary of the Treasury Connolly shades Agnew, for the vice presidential spot, according to the Harris poll in the papers this morning, as some of you no doubt read, 52 to 36. Well, let's, just for fun, run down the so-called prospects, keeping in mind, if you will, that although I'm billed as a commentator, a pretentious title, and somebody from Washington who is supposed to know the score, which is not necessarily the case, keep in mind that at a tender age, I voted for Herbert Hoover in 1932. On the 14th of July, the latest Gallup and Harris polls up to that time, the Gallup poll had 48% of the public approving the job the president was doing, and Lou Harris, in a slightly different category, had 50% of the polled population giving a positive reaction to his conduct of office. Then, July 15th and August 15th, you remember, there were two blockbusters. The announcement on July 15th of Mr. Kissinger's marathon talk with Mr. Zhou Enlai, and the fact that Mr. Nixon was going to Peking sometime between now and next May, if we can find Peking, and nobody's heard from it for the last 2 weeks. Then on the 15th of August, this complete reversal of Nixonian or Nixonomics with the new economic program. I was wondering what effect those two things had on the polls, and we researched it. On the 13th of September, Gallup said 49% finds approval of the president's job, and Harris didn't have that answer, but it said that 68% gave a positive reaction to the China trip, and as you've undoubtedly seen, as high as 75% approved at the time of the announcement what he was trying to do with the economy. Now, all of this doesn't prove anything, except that people like movement. It didn't increase his popularity with the public measurably at all, only 1% in the Gallup poll. But it does show that the people are captivated by action rather than reaction, something that we haven't had for some time, back since, really, to go back clear to the days of Mr. Truman. We haven't had a president in the White House who has done much more than react. If Mr. Kennedy had been there longer, he might have. As far as vote-gaining aspects of these two ploys in 72, I would say they're very questionable. So what does the president really have going for him at this point? First of all, he has his incumbency. We don't realize, either we in Washington or you out here in the country, we don't really realize the enormous power that the incumbent in such a cockpit as the presidency exercises. He can command us in the media at any time of the day or night. Commandeer television, radio, clearing space in the front of the newspapers. Air Force One swoops down in Des Moines. And I'm not saying this in terms of just Mr. Nixon. Any president has this advantage. This is one big thing to start with. Overall, I would say at this point, more plus than minus with the war winding down, but I don't think it's winding down fast enough. I think it's damaging the country and damaging the president himself for him not to disengage much faster than he has. And in terms of the prisoner of war issue, I'm afraid I think that the administration has phonied that up in the sense that playing on the emotions, when if we just read a little bit of history, we realize that on the whole, there are exceptions, but on the whole, prisoners of war are not exchanged until the hostilities are over anyway. Another thing that he has going for them in a fragile way, a fragile plus one might say, are the SALT talks. We've read in the papers that there seems to have been some kind of a tacit agreement to put a new hotline via satellite, particularly to avoid nuclear accidents or nuclear holocausts from nuclear accidents of a plane going beyond fail-safe or somebody setting off a rocket that he shouldn't have done. But I go along with those experts in this field in terms of the arms field, which is a very heavily mined field, I may say, in terms of bewilderment. Still, I go along with the argument that ABM is not a well-proved system in the first place, and therefore to argue that it is a bargaining counter is somewhat specious, because how good is a chip to bargain with if it isn't a good chip to begin with? Also, I'm worried about the nuclear explosion called Kanikin on Amchitka Island, which is supposed to take place sometime probably later this month. The Washington Post said this morning, unofficially, that it had been decided to do it. And this is hooked into ABM because, as you know, they're testing a warhead for ABM, and it just doesn't seem to me to make any sense to test it if the thing is going to be circumscribed by an agreement to limit or roll back ABMs anyway. But he does have, in this dangerous field, a slight plus. The Senate, incidentally, just to digress for a moment, didn't look terribly dignified and statesmanlike to me yesterday when it passed on a fairly large margin the deployment of ABM to two more sites, or to two sites basically, and also went ahead in the military procurement bill, some $20 billion, with the Navy's F-14 fighter, even though there has been a great deal of criticism of its performance, and even though Senator Proxmire, your neighboring senator over here, says that he is certain that the Phoenix missile, its air-to-air missile which it carries, has so far not proven out. It would seem to me that the statesman-like thing to do would be to wait till these questions are answered before you give money to them. But that's politics. Then another thing the president has going for him, but this is even more queasy than anything else, is the Middle East. I've spent some time in the Middle East this summer, both in Egypt and in Israel, doing a documentary in Egypt about Islam, and then going to Israel and doing some political reporting. And the overall impression that one gets, one comes away with, is that neither side really wants another conflagration, but that both sides are so rigid in terms of being unable to unbend to each other that it's dangerous. I had a long talk with a high official in the State Department yesterday. When you have a talk with an official in the State Department, it's nobody but a high official that you talk to. But it was right after the foreign minister of Egypt, Mr. Riyad, was having lunch with Mr. Rogers and a couple of others. And the impression one gets is that the Americans are sort of extremely cautiously optimistic that something may happen in terms of an interim agreement between Egypt and Israel before the end of the year. And if there is one, the Nixon administration deserves a great deal of credit for it because they have architected a ceasefire which so far has lasted for 14 months. Now, as far as the dollar and foreign trade are concerned, I am just not equipped to talk about it. I'm just not that expert. Difficult enough for me to balance my checkbook. But there is some ground for encouragement and a great deal of grounds for apprehension in terms of the possibility of a trade war. The International Monetary Fund convention and meeting in Washington has not been well enough digested yet for us to get a real feeling of what did go on, but it didn't break up in great animosity. But I'm afraid that a lot of people whose judgment I trust in this field believe that Mr. Connolly has been entirely too hard-nosed about his demand that we get a $13 billion reversal in our balance of payments. Don't mind, I'm going to get off this stuff in just a minute. It is an important thing. The dollar and foreign trade are just as important as the Middle East, Vietnam, and so forth, and we in the media don't pay enough attention to them in such a way that we can impart to you what their meaning is. This is one of the great deficiencies, I think, that we have in the trade of journalism. Still, the outlook there is not all bad, but in terms of politics, in terms of looking at the assignment that I've been given, we can't give Mr. Nixon a plus or minus at this point, 13 months before the election. Now, what's he got against him? You may be surprised at this, and I say this with a certain risk because it's going to sound as if I'm captious. And I don't mean to be. I've known Mr. Nixon since 1952. I went to Africa with him. I went to the kitchen debate with him in Moscow, and I've covered all of his major campaigns except the governorship of California. But I think one of the main things that Mr. Nixon has against him in terms of success or failure in 72 is Mr. Nixon. I mean by that he is an issue of himself, regardless of Vietnam, regardless of the economy, Peking, SALT talks, Middle East, etc. He is neither widely liked nor deeply believed. This is a fact. It's regrettable, but it is true. He knows this himself. Yet he and his administration insist on putting, I'm afraid, in many instances, politics above principle. The Haynsworth-Carswell nominations. Mr. Haynsworth, Judge Haynsworth, a mediocre man, and Judge Carswell, and this is not my judgment, but judgment of judges, including people on the Supreme Court itself, just not worthy of that high office. Now, what's going to come up in terms of the replacements for two monumental members of the court, the conservative Mr. Harlan and the middle-of-the-roader Mr. Black, nobody knows at this point. Representative Poff of Virginia is being considered. We'll just have to see, but we can only hope that whether they're conservatives or what they are, and they undoubtedly will be conservatives, and the president has every right to nominate a conservative, we can only hope that they are men or women of stature. This is enormously important. The president very likely will set the course of jurisprudence and the judiciary in this country for decades to come. He will already have appointed 4 men to the court, including the Chief Justice, and very likely, before his first term of office is over, he may have another. So that would be 5 out of 9. But I said politics above principle. What do I mean by that apart from, in addition to the business about the court? When Senator Muskie was possibly too candid in Los Angeles, saying that regrettably he felt that putting a black American on the ticket would not allow him to win in '72, Mr. Nixon called this a libel on the American people. Mr. Nixon called this a libel on the American people only a few days after he had said, in a calculated timing, that he was against busing after the very man that he put in the Chief Justiceship of the United States had led a decision on busing. The Republicans want to carry Texas in 1972. They've talked of law and order, crime in the streets, all of which we want, except not crime in the streets. And he cheered Governor Rockefeller for the handling of Attica. Well, the real crime is the neglect, the shameful neglect of a shameful situation in our prisons. Mr. Agnew hammers away at the media and at dissenting politicians. His latest crack against us was about our coverage of Attica and against 4 potential Democratic senator presidential nominees, against them for wanting to cut the military budget and getting out of Vietnam more quickly, and equating them with Gus Hall, the head of the American Communist Party. It makes me think of a sign in the Detroit Public Library: only low talk permitted here. In respect to the penal situation, you people are more acquainted with the exact quote than I am, so I have to paraphrase it. But you remember Dostoevsky said that you measure a civilization by the way it treats its criminals. The list of pragmatism in the White House is long and depressing. Pushing for the SST over a panel of experts appointed by the White House. Probable approval of the Alaska oil pipeline against a galaxy of expert opinion. Probably the Amchitka blast late in October, again against the counsel of all of the government agencies involved except the Atomic Energy Commission and the Pentagon. Whispering to Cardinal Cook in New York that he would like to see some assistance by the federal government to parochial schools. And the latest thing, squeezing expert economists out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because they didn't produce rosy enough figures. Now, these are all controversial points. I'm not saying that it's all black and all white, but I'm saying that the cumulative result of this, the cumulative effect of all this, is one of calculated politics without leadership, and is not conducive to inspiration in the White House. Somebody said, you remember that you know a man by the company he keeps. The Vice President, Martha Mitchell, J. Edgar Hoover, Billy Graham, Bob Hope. Now, please understand me. There is absolutely no reflection on the character or sincerity of any of these individual Americans. But I ask you in all candor, and in all sincerity too, is this group representative of the pick of the leadership of the United States of America in the third of the 20th century? Now we come to the Democrats. Somebody else said you can't beat somebody with nobody, but the Democratic body count is about the highest that I have ever seen it. There's a lot of talent, individually and collectively, but there's a great question of this awful thing called projection, charisma, you know what for, the tube. And also, whether they will all cut each other up in fighting for the spot front and center of that red-eyed tube. The newest starter on the Democratic side, Mr. Lindsay, could be called an idol in California, but not likely to sell in the middle provinces. I have a respect for him, even though he's got a miserable record as mayor of New York. Not all his fault. Anybody that would be mayor of New York, not once but twice, may have something wrong with him, or he may have a great deal of courage, probably a little bit of both. I know him, I respect him, but I find it very difficult to believe that he's going to make much headway in Democratic circles, because other people who are already in the Democratic circles are going to be jealous. If he should win the California primary going away, if he should make an enormous showing in New Hampshire, elsewhere, that changes the ballgame. Senator Bayh of Indiana, splendid man, one of the few senators who was a monument of strength in turning back the nominees of Mr. Carswell and Mr. Haynesworth. But outside of that, not much else to recommend him to the public as a whole, and at the moment, his campaign doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Senator Humphrey, extremely relaxed. I've never seen him so relaxed. He even talks a little bit less than he used to. He's biding his time, but I'm afraid, I think, that his time has passed and is not to be. Senator Harris, who was here last week, lovely man, with a lovely wife, with a lot of Comanche Indian blood in her. A very, very long shot, I would say. Scoop Jackson, a good deal of clout in the South. I had dinner with a senator from the South on Monday night who said that he was good in Florida and good in Texas. He's got a good domestic record. And when I say good, I'm translating it in my prejudiced way in terms of flexible domestic record, moderate, liberal, not reactionary. I found his hawkishness uncomfortable in foreign fields, but he's trimmed it lately, particularly in terms of Vietnam, when he told the president in no uncertain terms that really something should be done about it. He is somebody to be contended with because he can, of all of the Democratic possibilities, one who can collect both from the Senate and from the states a considerable and respectable galaxy of conservative Democrats. Senator McGovern has moved from 3% to 8% in the polls. At least that's moving up. Here is an extremely strong character, another neighbor of yours, working very hard, a man of great principle, but in this bloody age of television, so far doesn't seem to have devised a way to get himself across. Maybe he will. Then there is a whole gaggle of people, all of them loaded individually with talent and expertise. Wilbur Mills, Tennessee Congressman Anderson, the naval captain, you remember, who steered the Nautilus under the ice cap of the North Pole, a wonderful man from Tennessee. Senator Proxmire, the nemesis of the Pentagon, one of the most responsible, fiscally expert men in the whole Congress. But I don't think that they're likely to catch on, except in a minimal way, any more than Congressman Paul McCloskey on the Republican side is apt to. He does have a certain amount of this awful thing that seems to not be necessary called charisma, but he has got virtually no more than one issue, which is Vietnam. Whom did I forget? Oh, Muskie. Actually, Senator Ed Muskie does lead the pack, which is why he's getting really all of the slings and arrows. He's out there in front. He's a big target, physically particularly. He has stature, not only physically, a certain amount of diffidence and thoughtfulness, and he speaks, I think, with degree of integrity, but he is a very iffy commodity at this moment.
Has not caught on yet. He, on the other hand, has not really exposed himself totally. He hasn't even declared. He won't, I think, until the end of the year. But he has something that is important, I think. And this comes back to this curious business. I sound like Sigmund Freud. This curious business of the character and makeup of Mr. Nixon. He potentially hits President Nixon at his weakest point, which is, as I've tried to say, as unclumsily as possible, his inability to inspire respect and trust. This, on the other hand, is virtually Muskie's strongest point. It hasn't been tested totally yet, because he hasn't got the exposure yet, but this is very important. And this is why at least one political railbird I know in Washington says that the president, the White House at least, would prefer the Democratic candidate to be Senator Kennedy, because Senator Kennedy, due to the tragedy of Chappaquiddick, cannot assail President Nixon's Achilles heel the way Mr. Muskie can. Now, how much more than mere speculation this is, I don't know. But it is an important point, and one that should not be forgotten. This, admittedly, is not the most exciting cast of characters in the world on either side. Something did die with John F. Kennedy in Dallas. The inspiration of leadership, a certain grace, a certain style, a certain sense of humor. Now, perhaps we're being pathetic or bathetic in groping still for that. I'm not groping for Camelot, which I think never was anyway, but I think everybody, from hard hats to hippies, is really waiting for somebody to appear that can inspire trust and confidence. He hasn't appeared yet. Muskie may show it. He may fall flat on his large Lincoln-esque face. We can't tell. But it seems to me if there's one overall political fact, and it's more of a psychological fact than it is a political fact, common to the country today, it is this hunger among us for leadership that we can believe in. Somebody who shows it is going to be in like Flynn. It would be exciting. But ladies and gentlemen, I see something else very exciting coming up. Call this an in-house commercial if you like, but I'm going to say it anyway, and it involves really, if it were to be in its full excitement, actually the control of this election. I'm talking about you. 25 million of you who have not had the opportunity to vote in a presidential election before, from the ages of 18 to 25, can really be the determining factor in this presidential election. Now, don't be cynical. Don't, as they say in the ads, don't knock it. Don't knock the rum martini until you've tried it. You shouldn't be cynical, and I'm sure that many of you, most I hope, are not. Look what you did, or look what your confreres did in '68. Now, you can say that not much has changed in '68, and that is true. But something has changed. And things in a society as big as ours change by degrees anyway. You had an enormous impact on '68. From New Hampshire through March 31st, when President Johnson made his historic announcement of not running again, through Chicago, and even up through the elections. You know the scene better than I do in terms of what's happening. Ex-Congressman Allard Lowenstein, who headed the Dump Johnson move in 1968, is now running a Dump Nixon move, and he's had at least 7 rallies and student conferences around the country, perhaps one of them in Iowa, and there are more to come. And there are other kindred movements. Whether you have much interest in this election, whether you have a favorite, whether you're disenchanted at this point and are thinking about copping out, the fact is, and this I can tell you also as a fact, you've got the pros worried. They don't know what you're going to do. Sure, they say they're not going to vote, and if they vote, they'll vote like their parents, etc. Well, if they vote like their parents, those who vote are supposed to tilt toward the Democrats, but that's not sure. Let me quote a sentence or two from a front-page story in the New York Sunday Times. If only 50% of these 25 million vote next year, and only 2/3 of them vote Democratic, Nixon would lose 9 states that he won in 1968, 9 states representing 150 electoral votes, and there would go the ball game. Now, I'm not up here advocating the defeat of President Nixon. I am trying to give you, with a certain personal color, my judgment, honest as I can make it. It may well be that President Nixon should be reelected. But the point is that these 25 million new voters, whose prejudices and judgments are really not known, can have an enormous effect. And don't try to sell us this business that my vote doesn't count. President Nixon was a minority president, need I point out. He got a little more than 43% of the vote in '68, and if 500,000 people out of a votes cast of more than 72 million, if 500,000 people had voted for Humphrey, Humphrey would be in the White House. So don't demean a single vote. And if no national candidate really sweeps you off your feet, and this is possible, concentrate on the local, the state, and the congressional elections. There are 20 governors up, including Iowa this year, or next year, 33 senators, none in Iowa, 14 Democrats and 19 Republicans, and of course the whole boodle of the House of Representatives. Issues, you've got loads of them. Human justice, gun control, the ecology, it's still an issue. The reform of government, prison reform, vote reform, campaign reform. We spent $300 million in 1968 on the elections, more than was ever spent in the history of the United States. That's too much, because it was spent largely by big business, labor unions, individual millionaires with an axe to grind, and without any real opportunity for average people to have their say or to register their clout. The Republicans have been dragging their feet in terms of campaign reform, and 2 bills are still bottled up in the House, in a couple of House committees. And this week, You may have noted, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of dummy committees have sprouted up in which industry, including notably the dairy industry, have been contributing already campaign funds for President Nixon's reelection. Now, anybody has a right within the law to make contributions to anybody, but these are dummy committees to circumvent the law. One main hopeful thing here is that John Gardner of Common Cause is pushing a suit against the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Conservative Party on the basis of a 1925 law, alleging that they have violated it in campaign spending. There are a lot of things happening that are encouraging. I was telling Mr. Schwartz and some colleagues, students and graduate students of his at dinner that in my opinion, one of the most important men of our lifetime is Ralph Nader. Unknown a few years ago, made it for the public. So much so, and now you know he's made it because business, politicians are beginning to malign him as best they can. That's the best sign that a man has arrived. He's doing so well for the consumers that the White House left him out of a consumer conference. Another hopeful thing is this curious thing called Common Cause, run by John Gardner. I saw him the other night, and he said that renewals, it's been a year now since he began it, the renewals to his non-tax deductible $15 membership are coming in ahead of schedule. Public interest law firms, young honor graduates of Harvard and other law schools, foregoing $11,000 to $19,000 starting salaries to work in the public interest. Got people up the wall in Washington and California. Governor Reagan was spinning about it. There are more elective black office holders in the country than at any time since Reconstruction. Now, that isn't 1/50th enough, but it's something to begin with. The blacks are making headway in spite of the rest of us. A week ago tomorrow, Fred Harris announced his candidacy for the presidency, and I had an interview with him, and I asked him about the non-progress since the Kerner report. He was on the Kerner Commission, and he said there has been non-progress, to be sure. But one hopeful thing has happened. The blacks are feeling their own self-respect. He said, a little black girl, you can't shame a little black girl anymore by calling her black. They are getting their own courage out of themselves. Pride. Charles Evers, a black American, is running for governor of Mississippi. He's black. A very few years ago, he would have been lynched, even mentioning the name. That's not an exaggeration. His brother, Medgar Evers, was murdered. An NAACP official trying to enforce human rights for black citizens in Mississippi. These are things that cannot and should not be ignored. There's something brave and heroic about these and other situations which we in the media somehow don't catch as much as we should. We got the body counts, we got the Atticas, all of the things that are wrong, and these need to be put out as well. They certainly need not be suppressed. They must not be suppressed. But we need to strike a better and more accurate balance than we do. I, at the risk of sounding Pollyanna, want to say that I think there is hope for us. There have been times in the last 10 or 11 years when I've despaired. But look, we're still a country. We're still rich, too rich in some respects perhaps. we still don't reform ourselves quickly enough. We still haven't got enough of top leadership from whom we can choose. But look what's happened. Some of you are way ahead of me on this. A French radical, if you please, named Jean-Francois Revel, not the fellow who wrote the Bolero, but a French radical, has written a book called Without Marx or Jesus. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. I got it in French, but my French wasn't all that glib a few months ago, and I'm waiting for the full English translation. But what this book is about is the United States of America. He spent some time here, and his message is that there's only one place in the world where a revolution can happen in the 20th century, and it is the United States of America. And he wasn't talking about a revolution in which we burn down everything. He was talking about a revolution in which we're trying to solve problems and build up things. And I recommend it to you, even though basically it's a philippic against the French politicians and his own radical friends, and particularly against the ossification and inflexibility of the communist governments of the Soviet Union and communist China. It should make you feel thoughtful and a certain amount of pride. I ran across this quote the other day, and I don't know whether it's appropriate or not, but I like it, and I'm going to read it. Times of heroism are generally times of terror, but the day never shines in which this element may not work. The circumstances of man, we say, are historically somewhat better in this country than perhaps ever before. More freedom exists for culture, but whoso is heroic will always find crises to try his edge. Human virtue demands her champions and martyrs, and the trial of persecution always proceeds. It is but the other day that the brave Lovejoy gave his breast to the bullets of a mob for the rights of free speech and opinion, and died when it was better not to live. Now, this was not somebody contemporary commenting on the massacre of Attica or doing an instant analysis of Vice President Agnew's speech. This was Ralph Waldo Emerson, nearly a century and a half ago. Some truths endure. You are not going to have to die for your candidate, but if you work for the decencies you hold important, not necessarily the decencies that you were taught to hold important. I think, to coin a corny phrase, but a sincere one, I think you'll make this country a better place to live, and it can stand improvement, and I, for one, will be enormously grateful to you for it. Thank you.
I think the response speaks for itself, Mr. Morgan. We are now open for questions, and we will continue the questioning as long as it lasts, or until approximately 9:20 or 9:25, at which time we will adjourn to the green room over here for students and others who would like to meet Mr. Morgan personally. So, who has the first question?
Yes, ma'am. The question is whether I had any comment on Mr. Wallace. I suppose it would be more polite if I had no comment on Mr. Wallace. Actually, he is a hard-working politician, but I have this comment about Mr. Wallace, which is second-hand in the sense that I didn't think it up. My comment on Mr. Wallace is that he may be, without his knowing it, something of an anachronism. that he may not have the political clout in 1972 that he had in 1964 and again in 1968 when he gathered 9 million plus votes. Now, why is it possible that he is an anachronism? Things are changing in the South at almost breathtaking speed. It is quite possible, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others more thoughtful and knowledgeable than I, that the South will come to terms respectfully and respectably with the race problem better, more swiftly, and more thoroughly than the North. In 1970, when Mr. Nixon and Mr. Agnew tried their hysterical best to elect people to the Senate so that they could control the Senate in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida, and in Arkansas, just to name 4 states, there were elected 4 decent, moderate, civilized governors. Those states also elected, not altogether, new members of the Congress, new members of the Senate, new members of the House, new members of the Senate, who are a different breed than the breed, and I'm afraid I have to call Mr. Wallace something of a racist, and I suspect that that may be going out of style. I may be totally wrong. I've been totally wrong before. I hope in this case I'm not. Yes. Well, I'm way over my head here, about 6,000 feet over my head. That's the depth of the hole. The gentleman's question was a comment further about Amchitka, and is it a mistake? As you know, we are testing the world's largest man-made underground explosion, 5 million, the equivalent of 5 million tons of TNT, which is a warhead for the ABM. Now, I happen to think that in itself is a mistake because my information, which is not unimpeachable and which is controversial, nevertheless is that the ABM is an inferior system. But there are other aspects, many other aspects to this explosion, which it seems to me the administration is riding over. There was a presidential panel called, and I've forgotten whether there were 5 or 7 agencies on it. I think it was 5, but it may have been 7, and the only 2 dissents against the majority opinion recommending against the explosion of Amchitka were the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense. This is an area of volcanoes, one of the most densely concentrated areas of volcanoes in the world. It's on one of the major ocean faults, so that the prospect of a tidal wave, earthquake, volcanic eruption can't be brushed aside. It is true that many scientists have examined the thing carefully and have decided that it's worth the risk, that it isn't likely to happen. The other thing that is possible, that has happened before, is a radioactive leak, which if were to happen and things got into the atmosphere, we would technically be in violation of the Test Ban Treaty. All things together, it seems to me that it would be better to hold off on it. And as far as the administration's argument that it is necessary as a bargaining counter, it just seems to me to be ridiculous, because both the Russians and the Americans have said to each other and to themselves that basically that ABM is not a very good defense. How much bargaining can you do with a cracked chip? what was the first part of your question? Has it had an effect on what? On the press. The question was about the Supreme Court decision on the Pentagon Papers, and pointing out quite rightly that with the loss of Justice Black, there is only one person left on the court, I assume you're referring to Justice Douglas, who can be relied on to stand up for the First Amendment. That's not totally true, because Justice Potter Stewart and Justice Brennan have a very firm belief in the First Amendment, but I happened to be reading the Black opinion yesterday. I was doing a commentary. It was either yesterday or the day before, and it is true that the only opinion that really gave the thrust to the First Amendment was Black's opinion. Now, what effect has the decision had on the press, and what effect is there on the press of, I'm improvising now a little bit, correct me if I'm wrong, what effect is there on the press of the administration's attitude? Senator Ervin has been holding hearings in Washington the 3 days of this week on that precise question of freedom of information. And the testimony was pretty depressing. The testimony went pretty much to the thrust of your own question, that the very fact that the administration got away with what they call prior restraint for 15 days before the Supreme Court made the decision was in itself a defeat of the free press, because it violated the First Amendment strictures that there can be no prior restraint. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but this was a big point that Justice Black put out. But where we go wrong in the press and where we go wrong in the public is to take that no prior restraint to mean license for the press. That is to say, the public, or the hostile public, says, the press really only wants this so that they can do anything they want to, libel anybody they want to, blow anybody out of the water they want to. This is not the purpose of it whatsoever. And no purposeful, thoughtful, reputable journalist, editor, publisher, producer would ever think of doing anything like that. But the fact is, disgracefully enough, that we in the media are on, very much, dangerously so, on the defensive. Now, this is partly our fault. This is partly our fault, because we have not encouraged self-criticism or across-the-board criticism of a paper by a television station or vice versa. And also, we haven't tried to make it clear to the public what the role of the press is. The role of the press is certainly not to be popular. The role of the press is to make itself a bloody damn nuisance to people in government, to people in corporations, to people in labor unions, to people in groups, societies, to try to get at what they're doing. Now, I'm not talking about second-story jobs of scandals and pictures of paramours and that sort of thing. I'm talking about the Lincoln Steffens kind of thing. We have not done that. And certainly Mr. Agnew has not done it for us. He, in my opinion, has done one of the most disgracefully damaging jobs to the press by his irresponsible attacks. Mind you, I said we are ripe for attack. We're ripe for criticism, but not that kind, because the main principal purpose of Mr. Agnew's attacks was right here in Des Moines 2 years ago, almost this very night, to the one 3 or 4 days ago, and talking about Attica, was to discredit the press in the eyes of the public. This is terrible. This is terrible, because this is what a totalitarian does. A free press is discredited, so that we're in a bind. I don't know whether we're going to get out of it or not. I hope so. With a little more than a little judgment and a little courage, we may.
What reaction do you expect from the Nixon administration to the Senate's vote this afternoon about allow troops to go to China?
They will try. I haven't read I only got the news of it through Mr. Schwartz as we were driving, so I don't know the details of it, and I'm a little bit surprised because they had kissed it off yesterday after the facile passing of the draft, and the passing of what the administration wanted yesterday in terms of military procurement, but I think I can guess accurately that they will try to minimize it, that it has no, which it does not have, any legal bearing. It's simply a sense of the Senate. I may be wrong there. The wording of it may be worked into the Military Procurement Act more firmly than that. But I don't think it can get away from the fact, which a lot of people will call to the administration's attention, namely that this comes 3 days before the election of President Chu, who is running nobly against nobody. And to sum it up, it's an embarrassment that they wouldn't like to have, and I think it may revive the war issue, which they had hoped would be buried. It will certainly revive the war issue if there is a real fiasco on Sunday. When I say a fiasco, I can mean almost anything. A great deal of violence, a paper vote for Chu, if the public does what he invited it to do, to mutilate the ballots more than 50%, and that sticks, this could in some respects get the administration off the hook, because it's really on an embarrassing hook with the Chu thing, because I needn't remind this audience that for years, not just the Nixon administration, but all administrations have justified our commitment to Vietnam largely on the basis that we were sending our boys over there to fight and die to give them a chance to choose their government. Yes.